In this video, I'll be explaining the Financial Management Survey policy and the requirements for financial management of these funds as we focus on grant startup action steps for AmeriCorps grant year 2022 to 2023. I'll provide an overview of each section of the survey and highlight the OMB uniform guidance requirements that relate to the questions in the survey. And finally, I'll review how to submit the survey and what to expect next with grant startup. After watching this video, we'd like you to walk away with an understanding of the written policies and management systems that need to be in place to manage these federal funds, as well as an understanding of how to fill out the survey and what additional documents are required, and where to locate resources to support this process. So if you are currently focused on getting your AmeriCorps program up and running with the 22-23 grant year and need some resources to get acquainted with the general financial expectations of the YouthBuild AmeriCorps Grant, you can visit the Fiscal Management Resources webpage at youthbuild.org. For new programs joining the initiative or for those who manage the financial systems for the grant, the Financial Management Manual provides a broad overview of all of the federal regulations required and the administrative systems needed to document and track these funds. You can also find the written Financial Management Survey policy on the Fiscal Resources webpage for how the survey applies to your ability to claim reimbursement of AmeriCorps funds. And for an understanding of the legal federal framework for oversight of these funds, you should be familiar with and review the following on an annual basis. First are the AmeriCorps terms and conditions that provide the definitions and agreements of the grants. It provides a list of changes from the previous grant year that could have an impact on your operation of the grant. Next is federal uniform guidance requirements. This would apply to any federal funding source your program may receive. Uniform guidance sets the legal language around what is expected from your organization's administrative oversight of the grants and what type of documentation is required for the various expenses your organization's YouthBuild AmeriCorps program may incur throughout the grant year. And finally, you should review the YouthBuild AmeriCorps subgrantee agreement. This agreement with YouthBuild USA will set the financial reporting and monitoring expectations, as well as remedies for noncompliance. So I'll first review the policy itself and explain why we do this. YouthBuild USA is the prime grantee of the AmeriCorps State and National Grant and is responsible for evaluating organizations for any risk of noncompliance that could impact the overall AmeriCorps investment. This includes looking at your prior experience with managing any other federal grants. Are you following through on any instances of internal control or material weaknesses identified in the organization's annual financial audits? We'll assess the knowledge of current staff and systems that have been established at the program, and review the results of any relevant monitoring. So the Financial Management Survey is a tool to assess whether the program has established systems that maintain effective internal controls of this federal award. This is submitted as part of grant startup in the first year of participation within the 3 grant year period. And in years 2 and 3 of the grant year period, the program would provide a reduced version of the survey that simply verifies whether established policies have changed and includes the most recent financial audit required for the upcoming grant year. And the other reason for the survey is to provide a baseline understanding of your systems for your AmeriCorps financial manager. And since uniform guidance does allow for flexibility in how programs can approach their policies and procedures, this survey will explain what type of documentation the program will be submitting on a monthly basis as part of the monthly monitoring process that occurs prior to reimbursement of funds. Since your financial manager will be reviewing and providing feedback on monthly expenses, you can use this survey to provide helpful information about your process. This creates a full picture of how the grant is managed within your organization. Next, let's look at how we evaluate what systems and policies may need attention as well as how to fill out the survey. The Financial Management Survey includes the 5 following sections: the annual audit, written policies, funds management, internal controls, and match monitoring. In the first section of the survey, you will select the statement that applies to your program. If your program expends at least $750,000 in federal funds annually and are subject to the single audit, you would select that statement and let us know the status of your organization's 2021 audit. If the 2021 audit is still in process, you will provide the expected completion date. If you are not subject to the single audit, you would provide the organization's independent audit. And the remainder of the audit section will ask if there were any findings or corrective action plans established as a result of this audit. Section 2 has a list of essential written policies. You will simply select yes if the program has a written established policy and no if not. These specific policies are required by AmeriCorps and may be selected for monitoring at any time, either through monitoring initiated by YouthBuild USA or a monitoring request received from AmeriCorps involving a subgrantee. Please answer this honestly. If policies do not exist or need amended, your financial manager would facilitate an agreement where we would set a deadline to develop and implement specific policies. If you have submitted this survey in the past, you may remember submitting all of these documents along with the survey. We have changed our protocol this year and are only asking for one specific policy for review prior to the startup of grant year 22 to 23. And that is your organization's timekeeping policy and primarily how it relates to the allocation of staff time to the grant. So you will want to make sure that you attach a copy of these timekeeping policies along with a filled out survey. And the survey will identify the key uniform guidance section that pertains to personnel expenses. Now let's dive a bit deeper on time and effort reporting, since you will be submitting these written policies. These requirements can be found in uniform guidance under personnel compensation, and we are focusing specifically on the standards of documentation of personnel costs and how allocation across multiple funders or multiple cost objectives needs to be addressed in your organization's written policies. When it comes to the documentation of personnel expenses, your AmeriCorps financial manager is looking to verify three things. First is payroll, or simply what it costs to have an employee. Second, does documentation demonstrate why the cost is being charged to one or more cost objective? So you can think of a standard timesheet where staff allocate their hours across projects or funders on a daily basis. This is a simple method that demonstrates that staff are recording their hours after the fact and that they reasonably reflect the time and effort spent on the grant. And third, does the time and effort documentation support the amount or portion of the employee's gross pay charged to the grant? The documentation that you have available will depend on your organization and the systems you are working with. But uniform guidance does allow for flexibility, but they make it clear as to what needs to be achieved. Your records should accurately reflect the work performed, and there should be a reasonable assurance that everything is accurate, allowable, and properly allocated. So documentation should be able to support why a cost is being billed to AmeriCorps, and that it is accurately allocated based on whatever method is being used. And it's important that we point out one obvious pitfall here, and that's if you are not using any particular method other than budgeting staff salaries at the beginning of the grant year and not having the internal controls making sure the amounts charged accurately reflect the work performed. And uniform guidance makes this clear, as they state, budget estimates alone do not qualify as support for charges. There are some expectations here, but you start to walk a fine line and your written policies become paramount. You can use budget estimates for an interim period, but only if you have a system that can produce a reasonable approximation of work actually performed. So you would need to define the system, as well as the process for what happens when you detect significant changes in an activity. So what this means is there is a review and adjustment process or a reconciliation process. Someone at your organization needs to be responsible for checking the records and making sure that time and effort is reasonably accurate. How you do this is up to you, but all of this would need to be defined within your written timekeeping policies and procedures. You can't rely on simply telling your staff, hey, if something changes in terms of workloads, let us know. You need a system, not a hope and a prayer. If you take a look at audits with huge repayments, it is because the system itself didn't work. Now, considering the pitfalls that can occur in a system based on interim budgeted amounts or something a bit more complicated like a time study, we encourage programs to just go with a standard biweekly timesheet. This ensures that the amount charged to the grant is based on a reasonable approximation of the work performed, and it is reported after the fact. So there is no need to reconcile budgeted amounts or use any other complicated method to produce those reasonable approximations. As you can see on this timesheet, various funding sources or cost objectives are identified, and staff themselves can allocate their hours across those sources as they are the most reliable source to identify where they are spending their time. So, in the end, your organization should be able to answer the question, does time and effort documentation support the costs you're charging to the grant? This is typically done through the following documents. First is payroll, such as a pay stub, maybe an ADP payroll report that provides the gross pay for the period. Next are your timesheets that are certified by both staff and their supervisor that reflect the actual hours worked on the grant. And finally, the staff summary report. This is a template provided by YouthBuild AmeriCorps that calculates the amount charged to the grant by taking the gross pay on your payroll report against the percentage of time spent on the grant, which is reported on the timesheets from that period. These are the expense and match totals that you would be including in the monthly AmeriCorps reimbursement request. And so here's an example of what we would want to see in your timekeeping policies. Now, this is a very standard example if your program is using the standard biweekly timesheets. It states compensation for personnel is allocated based on actual time spent and recorded. The salaries and wages of staff assigned to only one program are allocated to that program based on timesheets or time cards. And the salaries and wages of staff assigned to more than one program or funding source maintain timesheets each pay period that indicate the amount of time spent on each program or funding source. Actual hours are then used to allocate salaries and wages. Any personal time, holiday pay, etc., in a specific pay period is allocated based on percentages of time worked. Now, moving on in the survey, the funds management section will help your AmeriCorps financial manager understand how AmeriCorps funds are tracked at the organization. The key compliance concern here is that a general ledger is maintained for each AmeriCorps grant year. This general ledger must align with the monthly AmeriCorps reimbursement requests submitted for the grant. So it asks questions such as, does the accounting system track the receipt and disbursement of funds by each funding source? Does the accounting system enable you to track and document the disbursement of funds from the original invoice through final payment? Does the organization use a job cost system? Does the organization have an approved indirect cost rate, or does it utilize the 10% de minimis rate? And what financial management software is used for accounting? The next section on internal controls points to a few key compliance concerns that should be addressed in the organization's written policies. Questions include, are the duties of the accountant separate from cash functions, such as the receipt or payment of cash? If not, what controls are in place to protect against fraud, waste, and abuse? Are checks signed by individuals whose duties include recording cash received, approving vouchers for payments, and the preparation of payroll? And are in-kind contributions supported by appropriate documentation that shows how the valuation was determined? And the final section focuses on meeting the match requirements of the grant and helping your AmeriCorps financial manager understand what other funders you may track match for. So questions include, do you budget, track, and allocate match for other grants besides AmeriCorps? How is AmeriCorps match budgeted and who is a part of that process? Do you capture match in the general ledger? In the same way that you account for AmeriCorps funds in the general ledger, the organization would need to maintain an AmeriCorps match general ledger for each grant year that ties to the submitted monthly AmeriCorps reimbursement requests. But if match is not tracked in the general ledger, what other tools are used for tracking? How is match allocated? And is this in a written policy? And how is match reported for staff time? You can access the survey template via a link in the program's AmeriCorps Grant Startup email, or you can go directly to the AmeriCorps Fiscal Management Resources webpage on myyouthbuild.org. Feel free to reach out to your AmeriCorps financial manager with any questions on how to fill out the survey. The deadline to submit the financial survey, the most recent financial audit, and written timekeeping policies is September 30th. Funds for grant year 22-23 will be placed on hold until the survey has been received, reviewed, and finalized. Your program can submit all of these documents to the Financial Management Survey folder within your AmeriCorps Fiscal Dropbox. Just be sure to notify your AmeriCorps financial manager once those documents are available. Please answer the questions honestly and as detailed as possible in order to assist your AmeriCorps financial manager in understanding the systems used to track the AmeriCorps grant. If systems or policies do not yet exist or are partially insufficient, please let us know. This is an opportunity to work with your financial manager to improve the financial management of the grant. If we have any concerns, we will provide a written agreement and a deadline for what we would like to see happen with the management of the grant before heading into the reimbursement of grant funds.